Hi Gears fans, and welcome back to a new video analysis. After more than 2 years of speculation, theories and questions, the Coalition has finally shown us much more of Gears of War E-Day, giving us our clearest picture yet of what this new chapter is really about. Today we're starting with the story, the human characters and the possible changes to the canon introduced by the Coalition. Since there's so much to cover, we've decided to split the analysis into multiple videos. In this first episode, we'll try to reconstruct the events shown in the trailers and understand where the main characters of the saga were during Emergence Day. As for the Locust, the possible antagonists and all the new gameplay features, we will cover those in the next deep dives. Get comfortable, because there is a lot to analyze. The new game will take place during the first 3 days of the conflict between humans and Locust. Emergence Day will serve as the main setting of the story, and for the first time will show us Marcus Fenix and Dom Santiago's perspective during the invasion. Following the end of the Pendulum Wars, the two find themselves in Kelowna to attend the celebrations marking the 2nd anniversary of the victory at Asphalt Fields. The footage shown by the Coalition allows us to reconstruct the context of the event fairly clearly. Marcus and Dom are attending the ceremony in their service uniforms, while Mayor Shaw pays tribute to the heroes of Asphalt Fields and everyone who fought in the battle. That same evening, the two young veterans meet at the Armored Prayer, a bar located in the downtown district of the city. For longtime fans of the franchise, this is a particularly familiar name, as it references one of the most iconic tracks from the Gears of War 2 soundtrack. Marcus and Dom are remembering Carlos Santiago, Dom's brother, who died during the Battle of Asphalt Fields after sacrificing himself to prevent Marcus from losing his life while trying to save him. It is also an important moment for understanding the relationship between the two protagonists. At this stage of the story, they are not yet the brothers-in-arms we will come to know in later years, but two soldiers shaped by war and united by the memory of the same person. Also present inside the bar are the other two protagonists of the campaign, although at this point the four characters do not know each other and have simply ended up there by chance, before Emergence Day brings them together as a team. However, it is worth taking a closer look at E-Day's protagonist as the invasion begins to unfold. Marcus Fenix is at the height of his military career, widely regarded as one of the COG's most promising soldiers, years before the decision that would ultimately change the course of his life. At his side is Dominic Santiago, still living with Maria and his children and leading a very different life from the one we will encounter in the original trilogy. Joining them are Max Carter, a former Gear from Kelowna who found work in the emulsion refineries after the war, and Lucas Reyes, a CIC member who never fought directly on the front lines during the Pendulum Wars. Outside, however, the situation is rapidly spiraling out of control. Across Kelowna, the first emergence holes begin to open, and within moments the streets are transformed into a battlefield. The squad immediately heads into the streets and comes face to face with an enemy unlike anything they have ever seen before, reaching a nearby police vehicle and recovering a few snub pistols in an attempt to contain this new threat. Without a real plan and still unable to grasp the true scale of the attack, the group moves through the streets of Kelowna, gathering weapons and survivors, until Lucas intercepts a distress call over a police radio from a soldier trapped inside a grocery store. Their destination changes immediately, and the four head toward the Pay and Save. Inside the building, they find Mako Kamara mowing down dozens of wretches with his Vulcan. When he runs out of ammo, however, the soldier is forced to fight with his bare hands and is saved at the last moment by Marcus. The battle inside the grocery store is far from over. Locusts continue to pour into the building, and it is here that we witness one of the most interesting moments of the entire demo. Marcus comes face to face with a drone, providing the first visual adaptation of a detail that, until now, had only existed in books and comics. When Marcus strikes the Locust with the Retro Lancer's bayonet, the attack proves almost useless, reflecting the long-established lore that standard Pendulum Wars bayonets were largely ineffective against the Locust's resilient, scaly skin. The sequence is interesting for another reason as well. While Marcus is fighting for his life, Dom is busy battling other Locusts and does not immediately realize what is happening. It may seem like an insignificant detail, but it once again highlights how different their relationship is from the one we will see in later years. The Dom of the original trilogy constantly watches Marcus' back and repeatedly puts himself in danger for him, whereas in Idei that bond has not yet become so deep. The blow delivered by the drone is also destined to leave a lasting mark. The slash is inflicted in the exact same spot where Marcus will later carry one of his most recognizable scars. Until now, it was generally believed that the mark had been caused exclusively by the dogs at the slab, whereas Idei shows us that the scar is actually the result of multiple injuries accumulated throughout his life. As Marcus continues to struggle against the drone, his rescue does not come from Dom, but from a face longtime fans of the franchise know very well. It is Ty Caliso who comes to his aid, killing the Locust and allowing the squad to survive the assault. His appearance is one of the most important moments of the entire demo, because it also introduces the chainsaw scene and, as a result, the first major connection to the origin of the Lancer we all know. From this point onward, however, the footage shown by the Coalition becomes far more fragmented. The various sequences appear to come from different moments of the campaign and were clearly selected to avoid revealing too much of the story. Even so, a number of details still allow us to make some fairly solid assumptions about the path that lies ahead for the protagonists. After the initial chaos, it is likely that Marcus, Dom, Max and Reyes will attempt to reach one of the command centers still in operation in order to officially return to the ranks of the military and organize a response to the invasion. There they encounter Akila Grey, one of Idei's new characters, who appears to be one of the highest-ranking officers present in Kelowna and could very well be the person responsible for officially forming Bravo Squad. In one of the sequences, she is also seen alongside Mayor Shaw. Considering the character's role and the state of the city, it is possible that part of the campaign will revolve around the mayor's evacuation or protection. The dynamic between Akila Grey and Mayor Shaw could also echo the relationship we saw in the past between Hoffman and Prescott, where political priorities and military necessities often found themselves at odds. Another particularly interesting scene shows Lucas explaining a possible route into an area of the city equipped with a radio antenna. The objective appears to be contacting Ephira and requesting assistance. Whether the attempt succeeds or not, we know that Marcus and Dom will eventually make their way back to their hometown. Ephira would remain one of the Coalition's main strongholds for many years after Emergence Day, and a large portion of the events that followed the fall of Kelowna would take place there. It is during one of the military reinstatement procedures that Marcus also mentions his father, Adam Fenix, who is already in Ephira at the time of the invasion. His role in the story, however, remains largely unclear. And this is where some of the most obvious differences from the lore we have known for years begin to emerge. Let's start once again with Ty Caliso. The chainsaw scene shown by the Coalition may seem like a simple tribute to one of the franchise's most iconic weapons, but for longtime fans it actually represents a significant change to the established lore. In the original continuity, this moment takes place about 1 year after Emergence Day, following the deployment of the Hammer of Dawn, when Ty kills a Locust with an ordinary chainsaw and unintentionally inspires Adam Fenix to develop the first Proto-Lancer. Idei moves these events directly into the opening hours of the invasion, breaking the original canon and raising new questions about the weapon's development, even if it may help explain why chainsaw-equipped Lancers already appear in Gears of War Judgment just 1 month later. Ty's presence in Kelowna, however, is not a problem. He also fought at Asfo Fields, making his attendance at these celebrations perfectly plausible. The situation surrounding Dominic Santiago is considerably more complex. Unlike Marcus, Dom's whereabouts during Emergence Day have been established multiple times over the years and represent one of the most firmly established elements of Gears of War lore. Novels, comics, and even a flashback featured in Gears of War 2 all present the same scenario. Dom is at home in Ephyra with Maria. Their children are out with their parents, and for at least a few hours, the couple can finally spend some time together. E-Day, however, completely changes this scenario. During the event shown by the Coalition, Dom is in Kelowna alongside Marcus, and in the scene set at the Armored Prayer, we even see him calling Maria. On the surface, this change might seem relatively easy to explain. The Coalition could simply have decided to move Dom to Kelowna while leaving Maria in Ephyra, while still preserving the events that follow. The real problem emerges when we look at what we know about the death of his children. In the original lore, the children are at a park with their grandparents when the invasion begins and are killed during the Locust emergence. The event is fundamental to Dom's character and represents one of the tragedies that will define his journey throughout the rest of the saga. This is where a second inconsistency appears. Emergence Day has always been described as a simultaneous global attack. In the novels, the comics, and even in The Rise of Ram, the invasion is depicted as taking place during daylight hours. In E-Day, however, the attack on Kelowna clearly takes place in the evening. Considering how close Kelowna is to Ephyra, it is difficult to explain this discrepancy through time zones or other geographical factors. For this reason, the change introduced by the Coalition appears to go far beyond simply moving Dom from one city to another. Some of the most important events in his story may have been altered or reorganized to fit this new version of Emergence Day. At the moment, it is impossible to know whether these are simply narrative adjustments or the beginning of a broader revision of the established continuity. And that is precisely the most interesting question. Did the Coalition choose to return to Emergence Day simply to tell a new story, or is it using this period in history to reorganize and refine a canon that, across books, comics, and video games, has accumulated numerous inconsistencies over the years? To try to answer that question, it is worth taking a look at some of the other major characters in the saga. One of the advantages of setting E-Day during a period that has already been explored through novels and comics is that we already know where many important characters were when the invasion began. This allows us not only to speculate about who might appear in the game, but also to understand which elements of the lore the Coalition has chosen to preserve and which ones it may have decided to alter. Let's start with Augustus Cole. Gears of War E-Day confirms a detail that had never been addressed before. If the Cougars were Hanover's thrashball team, we now know that the Eagles, the team Cole played for, were based in Kelowna, and that Oria Stadium was their home field. This means we will likely find numerous references to Cole throughout the city, but a direct appearance seems rather unlikely. His perspective during Emergence Day has already been told in Coalition's End, and we know that his first meeting with Marcus and Dom will not take place until many years later, during the events of the original Gears of War. Damon Baird's situation is even more straightforward. Despite the many inconsistencies that already exist between the books and Judgment, everything suggests that during Emergence Day he was still a young cadet who had only recently entered the military academy. Even assuming he was following an accelerated officer training program, his presence in Kelowna would make little sense, and bringing his first meeting with Marcus forward would risk creating even more continuity problems. Anya Stroud and Victor Hoffman, on the other hand, were already shown during the prologue of Gears of War 4 alongside Kim. We therefore know that they were in Ephyra during the invasion, near the House of Sovereigns. In this case as well, an appearance during the early stages of the campaign seems unlikely. If they do appear, it is easier to imagine them showing up during the final sequences, when Marcus and Dom finally manage to reach Ephyra. Adam Fenix, however, is a very different case. We know that he was in the capital, and more importantly, he was the only human being who knew of the Locust's existence. For that reason, it is difficult to imagine him abandoning his research in order to personally reach his son. A role through long-distance communications or a brief appearance during the final stages of the story seems far more plausible. Bernie would probably be the character who makes the most sense to find in Kelowna during the Asphalt Field celebrations. However, her story during Emergence Day has already been told as well. We know that she was in the Galangi Islands and had been ordered to organize the local resistance. More interesting, however, is the case of Pat Salton. Although he has never appeared in a video game, he is a popular character from the novels and comics and a veteran of the Pendulum Wars. In the years following Asphalt Fields, he serves alongside Marcus, Dom and Ty, and is also present during the canonical version of the chainsaw scene. As a result, it is entirely plausible that Pat is still part of Ty's squad during the events of E-Day. With Jill Gettner already confirming that the Coalition is drawing from the books and comics, Pat would be a logical addition to the story. President Thomas Dalyell will almost certainly appear through news broadcasts and official communications directed at the population, while Richard Prescott's role is much harder to place. At the time, he was not yet a central figure within the Coalition, and at least for now, there is no evidence suggesting any direct involvement in the events of Kelowna. It is precisely by examining the whereabouts of all these characters that a rather interesting picture begins to emerge. In some cases, the Coalition appears to have followed the events described in the books and comics almost perfectly. In others, however, the differences from the original lore are much more evident. The impression is that E-Day is trying to strike a balance between respecting the existing material and making certain events in the saga more coherent. On one hand, there is a clear effort to draw from the entire Gears of War universe. Characters such as Carlos Santiago and Jill Gettner, the references to Asphalt Fields, and the numerous connections to the novels demonstrate a deliberate effort to bring attention to material that remained on the fringes of the video games for many years. On the other hand, some events appear to have been altered in significant ways. Dom's location during the invasion, the timing of Emergence Day, and the reinterpretation of the origin of the chainsaw-equipped Lancer do not perfectly align with what has been established so far. It is still far too early to determine whether these are simply narrative adaptations or the beginning of a broader revision of the canon. From my point of view, I believe some important changes are inevitable. Over the years, the story of Gears of War has expanded through games, novels and comics written by different authors, often without a centralized oversight of the entire narrative universe. This has led to the creation of numerous inconsistencies, many of which already existed before the arrival of E-Day. Just think of Judgment, Tactics, or even the prologue of Gears of War 4. All of which introduced elements that are difficult to reconcile perfectly with the rest of the saga. For that reason, I would not necessarily view a revision of the canon as something negative. If handled in a clear and coherent way, it could actually improve the accessibility and overall consistency of the story. For the first time in many years, the Coalition seems to have decided to directly confront some of the most important moments in Gears of War history, instead of leaving them confined exclusively to novels and comics. Whether this decision will lead to a more coherent reconstruction of the narrative universe or mark the beginning of a new version of Gears of War's story is still impossible to say. One thing, however, is certain. E-Day is not simply telling the story of the beginning of the war against the Locust. It is reopening discussions about events, characters, and connections that fans have been debating for nearly 20 years. For now, all we can do is analyze the clues left behind by the Coalition and wait to see how they will be connected in the full game. In our next deep dive, we will leave the human side of the story behind and focus instead on the Locusts, the Horde, and the possible antagonists of the campaign. I'm Screech93. This is Go Series Videos. Thanks for watching.